Our presentation was on the Holt v. Hobbs case, and it was done by Jake Church, Jack Cody, Grace Garlick, and Caitlin Grimaldi. Just as an overview of what we'll be covering is the background of the case, the ethical issues raised, the arguments presented by the court, and then tying the material back to our textbook.
Who is Gregory Holt? Also known as Abdul Malak Muhammad, he is a Muslim prisoner who is serving a life sentence for murdering his former girlfriend. Who is Ray Hobbs? He is the former director of the Arkansas Correction Department. He has almost 40 years in the department, and he holds a master's degree in criminal justice. Background of Holt versus Hobbs. Holt is a devout Muslim who participates in Hadith. He concluded that his faith compelled him to leave his beard to its entirety. However, the Arkansas prison institutionalized a protocol that prohibited prisoners to grow any beards, excluding a quarter-inch for medical purposes. Holt sought an exemption from this policy by filing a request with prisoner grievance for permission to grow a half-inch beard as a compromise. The request was rejected. Holt was forced to choose between engaging in conduct that violated his faith or ignoring the prison's grooming policy and risking disciplinary actions. The rejected request led to complications. The district court misunderstood the analysis that RULAPA demands. Under Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Person Act, Holt bears the initial burden of proving that his faith is grounded in a sincerely held religious belief, and that the government action substantially burdens his religious exercise. Once Holt satisfied these requirements, the burden shifted to the government. The government's reasoning inaccurately imported a strand of analysis relating to prisoners' First Amendment rights. The court's reasoning of providing other forms of religious practice for Holt, including a prayer rug, Islamic reading material, religious advisor, the required diet, and the observance of certain holidays is invalid. The court committed another error when it suggested that Holt's religious canon was slight. RULAPA applies to Holt's exercise religion regardless of whether it is compelled. RULAPA protects no less than the guarantee of the Free Exercise Clause. It is not limited to beliefs which are shared by all members of a religious act.
Now we will go into detail about the trial process itself, as it went through the different levels of courts before finally reaching the Supreme Court. As we previously mentioned, Holt brought a proposal to the prison that he was in to allow him to grow a half-inch beard. The precedent he used to support his case was a previous case in California that allowed Muslim prisoners in the state to grow half-inch beards for religious reasons. The prison officials, however, denied his request. The case was presented to a magistrate judge for the district courts. The magistrate judge recommended to deny Holt's request. The district court sent the case back to the magistrate judge for a hearing. Holt argued that there was no way he could hide contraband in his beard, and therefore it wasn't a security risk. The prison officials argued that not only could he hide contraband in his beard, but he could also shave it if he escaped, thus altering his appearance to make it harder for people to catch him. The magistrate judge ended up siding with the Arkansas prison officials, deferring to their expertise regarding security matters within prison. The district court adopted the recommendation and the circuit court affirmed the decision. In 2014, the Supreme Court decided to hear the case. The Supreme Court justices unanimously reversed the previous decision, stating that the Arkansas prison's grooming rules violated the Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Person Act. Policymakers may not burden a person's exercise of religion unless they can show a compelling governmental interest and that the policy was the least restrictive means of achieving that goal. Arkansas officials could not prove that a short beard was enough of a security risk. The Supremacy Clause proved that the Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act preempts the Arkansas prison officials' ruling. After the unanimous vote in favor of Holt, 2 justices gave concurrences on the case. The 2 agreed on the ruling, but they differed in their reasons for the ruling. Justice Ginsburg said that accommodating Holt's request would not detrimentally affect those who did not share his same beliefs. In other words, his decision would not affect other people's rights. Justice Sotomayor said that Arkansas's officials failed to prove why Holt's less restrictive compromise of a half-inch beard failed to achieve the governmental compelling interests such as safety and security.
The case brings up the ethical issue of does this violate a religious right? According to the prison, the point of the grooming policy is to prevent the prisoners from hiding contraband in their beards, as well as to help with identification purposes. The guards claim it would be confusing if a prisoner had a beard for a while and then shaved it. On the opposite side of this is Holt's argument, where he claims it violates his RLUIPA right and that growing a beard is a necessary part of his religion. Looking at the black arrow on the side, that is the length prisoners with skin conditions can grow their beard at this particular prison. And looking at the red arrow is Holt's desired length of a beard. There's not much difference between the two beard sizes. The acts that helped grant Holt his right is the Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act and the sister act, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. RLUIPA protects any exercise of religion, whether or not compelled by or essential to a system of religious belief. RLUIPA applies to any state or local government imposing the burden if they have received funding from federal government. The prison Holt is at does receive funding from the federal government, which means he does get protection under RLUIPA. This act also applies when the burden affects the interstate commerce and when the burden arises from the state or local government's formal procedures for making individualized assessments of a property's uses. The RFRA Act states government shall not substantially burden a person's exercise of religion if the burden results from a rule of general applicability unless the government demonstrates the application of the burden to the person. This means the prison must prove it is the least restrictive means of furthering the interests, which in this case it is not. Furthering this ethical issue, when on trial, the department failed to show that forbidding very short beards is the least restrictive means of preventing the concealment of contraband. They were unable to show why a quarter-inch beard could be searched but a half-inch beard could not. They also failed to show why the vast majority of states permits inmates to grow a half-inch beard, but theirs does not allow any prisoners to grow beards unless they have a medical condition. The result of this long trial ended with the ruling being overturned. The Supreme Court reversed the original ruling made by both the District Court and the Eighth Circuit Court of Appeals because they stated it violated both RLUIPA and RFRA.
Now it's time to talk about what we learned in class and apply it to the case. The first thing that comes to mind is common law. It's a collective body of work that helps courts make decisions, and obviously it's throughout history. So we established it early in the case. The RLUIPA and the RFRA gave Holt, and obviously the Supreme Court, grounds to make a decision. It's kind of hard to believe that there was even a problem to begin with, considering what has been passed through the RLUIPA. In 2005, the Coulter versus Wilkinson case, where there's 5 prisoners in Ohio that brought a suit up against the state, saying that they were being persecuted in their prison. They were a sect of Christians that were racist and did some pretty messed up things as their practices. But the U.S. Supreme Court ultimately disagreed with the lower court's decisions and said that the government itself severely burdened the prisoners' religious rights. So the Supreme Court has already made a decision similar to what Holt is asking for in the past, and that was even to more of an extreme. So common law allowed Holt to make a claim and ultimately got the justice he deserved. The next bullet we have is stare decisis, and that's let the decision stand. The main principle is the lower courts must follow the higher courts, so even if the lower courts say no or turn you down. If it ends up going to a higher court, like in this case it did, then the higher court obviously has the right to make the decision. So kind of like what we talked about, it went through the district courts and temporarily got a relief and was ultimately dismissed. And then it went to the U.S. Court of Appeals, which is the 8th Circuit, affirmed, and they affirmed it. So then it then went to, in 2014, the Supreme Court, and they unanimously reversed the previous decisions, and just stating again that the Arkansas prison didn't have any proof and that there was a problem and it was obviously persecuting or violating his religious rights. And then finally, the last bullet we have is common law, which is wrongs committed against society. This one's pretty obvious. This was a criminal. This was in the criminal court, so it's a criminal law. It was brought up against the state of Arkansas, so that makes it a criminal law. The person that is being sued is the person who suffered harm, so that is ultimately Holt, who is suffering the harm. The wrongful act is that he is not allowed to grow his beard for religious purposes, so that's pretty obvious. Burden of proof is preponderance of the evidence, so there has to be a lot of evidence that so the court can approve or even overturn prior decisions, and that was, again, compared to the Wilkinson versus Coulter case, it's pretty obvious that there was preponderance of the evidence that the Supreme Court ultimately had enough evidence to make the proper decision, and it needs to be a 3/4 majority, and the Supreme Court ultimately ruled 9-0. Now it's time to talk about what we learned. Just to continue of like what we learned in class, this is just going through the steps of the case basically, and I kind of touched on it in the last slide. So the original jurisdiction, the case was in Arkansas. Obviously, it's in the lower district courts, and then it works its way up. So it's just where the trial court, where the dispute takes place. This is where the evidence is first presented, and it's the first time it's heard, and then you move on from there. Standing the sue, its property being sued suffered harm. The party bringing the suit has a significant stake in the case to justify like what's happening. So obviously Holt suffered harm, and that he couldn't practice his religion. This one is also kind of obvious. So going on with the plaintiff's complaints. So this is kind of where it gets a little dicey. The plaintiff is the prison and the state. They said that obviously, as we talked about earlier, that could be contraband hidden in the beard, and they're also concerned about him possibly escaping and then shaving, and then him being hard to recognize, or even him shaving his beard while he was in prison, making him hard to identify. So that was their complaint, that was their allegation, and that's kind of what turned it. So it goes the standing, which is what Holt put forward, the plaintiff and the suit itself, the plaintiff's complaint, so then they rebuttal, and then the defendant answers, which is again Holt, and he admits or denies what happened. Excuse me. So Holt, knowing that he had grounds to stand on with the RLUIPA and the RFRA, knew that he can continue on with his allegations. And then the counterclaim is made by the defendant against the plaintiff. So that's kind of what I was just talking about. The prison and the state went through the district court and the Court of Appeals, claiming that they couldn't justify allowing this one prisoner to have a beard while the other ones couldn't, and that the beard itself probably wasn't a big deal because it was 1/4 of an inch. So that's just kind of taking you through the case step by step. So to continue on with relating what we learned in class and applying to the case, kind of going off about the last slide, the pretrial notions. Basically, that's before going to trial. Any pleadings, any decisions to be made will be decided before the trial. Sometimes there'll be intermediaries to work out any differences so that the court doesn't need to be prolonged in trial. Just kind of talking about the case a little bit, the district court granted temporary relief to to halt and allowed him to grow the beard temporarily until the state and the prison can bring forth any evidence to otherwise say he couldn't. And basically, they said that Hull can practice his own religion a different way, and that was obviously a security problem. So, kind of going into like the ethical side of this whole case, duty-based ethics is an ethical philosophy rooted in the idea that every person has a central duty to others, including both humans and planet. This is kind of obvious. Obviously, the Supreme Court got the answer right, and but the fact that this was a problem to begin with, and it wasn't a problem in 43 other states and in California, and there's been other similar cases that have been worse than this where prisoners have been allowed to do more. This didn't seem like a big deal, so this is kind of an ethical problem. I don't think that the prison guards needed to bring it to the extent that it did. So that's kind of the duty-based ethics behind it, that all people should be treated with some respect. Obviously, it's difficult with the prisoner, but he is still a human and still he's still allowed rights. So going on the principle of rights, it's the rights and legal, social, and ethical principles for freedom or entitlement. That is the rights for fundamental normative rules. So it's kind of similar to duty-based ethics, but there's a couple differences. In other words, society should be organized so that people can coexist and legally equal and have unrestricted freedom to the act. This was established, or there was a provision in the 14th Amendment that requires that state governments to treat similarly to all individuals no matter what. So again, prisoner, he's not being treated equal. Anywhere else, this wouldn't be a problem. 43 other states in the prison system, this wouldn't be a problem. But for some reason, in Arkansas it is. So just under the Equal Protection Clause, this was just another thing that in class that we felt was apparent to be a problem. And this prisoner was not being treated equally like everyone else. Obviously, his rights are restricted, but to the point that this was a whole fiasco, it's pretty obvious that there was an Equal Protection Clause problem there.